Good morning, church. It is great to be back in Lake City, Florida. Time flies. I'll tell you, it's been 26 years since we moved from here, and it just seems like just a few years ago. But walking around, seeing everybody, things change. You know, some of you guys have gotten older. Things have changed, but the women are just as pretty as ever. I don't know what's going on. We haven't changed a bit. My wife is just as beautiful as she always was. My hair changed colors a little bit. Grandkids now, but not too much has changed, but a lot has changed. A lot of folks here I'm not familiar with, a lot of folks I don't know, but appreciate you inviting me over. Figures we'd have hurricane of the century when you do invite me over. So it reminds us we take a lot of things for granted, right? Power, for one thing. You know, we just got our power back Friday night. I think some of you just got it back last night. Some of you don't have it back. I was told up till yesterday morning, I think there was no power in the building. And Jim told me, said, we'll meet in the fellowship hall. I said, well, I'm wearing shorts. I know, bud, I have a heart attack, but I'm still wearing shorts. And I wasn't so sure today, so I brought my scissors with me just in case I need to cut my pants off. Little Johnny went to church one Sunday morning, and he was sitting out on the pews with his dad, listening intently to the preacher, and listening intently to a few comments his dad had to say. And after church, little Johnny went up to the preacher, and he snugged on his coat, and he says, "Preacher," he says, "when I get grown and get a job, I'm going to give you some money." And the preacher said, "Well, Johnny, that is incredibly generous, but why would you give me money?" He said, "Well, my dad said you were the poorest preacher we ever had." So I hope that isn't your sentiments when I finish here today, but I do appreciate the invite. If you want to turn in your Bibles, we're going to go to a familiar chapter today. We're going to be studying out of Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. This is a familiar chapter to all of us, but I think there's some little nuggets of wisdom that we can still learn from the scriptures here. The first two verses of this chapter sets the stage for the entire chapter, if you will. And they read, "Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes complained, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" You see, the Pharisees had nothing to do with sinners. And here they actually criticized Jesus for associating with sinners. But Jesus answered their objection or their criticism here in this chapter by giving three different parables that makes up the entire chapter. You remember the first chapter we're talking about where the man had 100 sheep and he lost one, and he let the 99, he let them go, he went and he found the one. The theme of this parable and the whole chapter for all that is down in verse 7. Look at verse 7. It says, "I say unto you that likewise joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth, more than over 99 just persons which need no repentance." The second parable we find in this chapter is the parable of the lost coin. This is where the woman had 10 coins and she lost one. She swept her house diligently until she found what was lost. Then she rejoiced with her friends and her neighbors over having found that which was lost. And if you look down at verse 10, again, we have the theme of the entire chapter again. And the verse reads, "Likewise, I say unto you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner that repenteth." And then the rest of this chapter, chapter 15, is made up of a third parable. And this is the parable I like to call the parable of the lost boy. Many know it as the parable of the prodigal son. Probably one of the most two popular parables in the world that people in the outside world are familiar with. And that's where we're going to focus our lesson this morning. I know we've heard a lot of sermons through the years on the prodigal son, on the lost boy, but hopefully, once again, that there's some nuggets here that we hadn't thought about, that we haven't heard about, and maybe that we can learn and apply to our lives. First thing I need to know is, are you listening? Are you listening this morning? There's a story that was going around Washington, D.C. about our former president, Franklin Roosevelt. He got tired of smiling that big smile and saying all those usual things that he would say at the White House receptions. So one evening, he decided to find out whether anybody was listening to him or not. anybody was paying attention. So as each person came up, he extended that hand, he flashed that big old smile that he was famous for, and he says, "I murdered my grandmother this morning." Well, people would automatically respond with comments such as, "Great job, Mr. President. Keep up the good work, Mr. President. How lovely, Mr. President." Nobody listened to what he was saying except for one foreign diplomat. And when the president said, "I murdered my grandmother this morning," the diplomat responded softly, "I'm sure she had it coming, Mr. President." So are you listening? Hopefully we can learn something by listening this morning. First of all, we want to realize that Jesus, in my opinion, he did not tell this parable to focus on the prodigal son or the lost boy at all. He told this parable to focus on the attitude of the older brother. His attitude, you see, was the same of what we just described a while ago, the attitude of the Pharisees. They didn't want any sinners come back. They didn't welcome them back. They didn't want anything to do with these people. And the older brother's attitude concerning his returning younger brother represented the same attitude as the Pharisees toward the sinners at that time that were listening to Jesus. So let's begin somewhere around verse 11. We'll go through verse 27, the prodigal son, and that will be our lesson for today. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the boy at home. You know, let's first notice here that he was restless. Look down in verse 11. Jesus began this parable by saying, "Then he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me.' So he divided to them his livelihood." You know, if I were a betting man, I would bet that many times that boy had looked down the road and probably said, "Man, if I could ever get away from here, if I could ever get away from here and get where the action is, then I'd be happy." How many times have we thought some of the same thoughts, especially as we were young? And probably most of us, one time or another, have looked to the anticipation of a time when we were going to be happy, not even considering the blessings that we have now. I'll tell you, we went down to Suwannee yesterday to help some friends clean up their house. And I'm going to tell you what, count your blessings. That is complete devastation down there. And just think, maybe 2 or 3 days ago, everything was fine. They had it all. Everything was good. They were happy. And you go down there now, it's complete devastation. They're completely wiped out. So don't take your blessings for granted. I heard a preacher tell a story once, and I believe it was Brother Neil Pryor, and it might have actually been here. Well, it would have been in the old building, but there was a young boy, and a friend asked him in high school, "Are you happy?" And he said, "How can I be happy? Got no car, got no money, got to go to school and study. I could never be happy in this." He said, "Well, when? When would you be happy?" He said, "Well, I think I'll be happy when I go to college." Well, work. Don't like the dorm. He didn't like his roommate. Food's terrible. Can't get his papers written on time. No way I can be happy in college. Well, when? When would you be happy? His friend asked. He said, "Well, when I get married and get a job, then I'll be happy." Well, guess what? Bills. We know how it goes. Can't pay the rent. The car's broken. The refrigerator doesn't run. Something wrong around here all the time. How could I ever be happy in this mess? When? Well, when I get a better job, when I make more money, when I'm able to move out of here and buy my own house, start a family, then I'll be happy. Well, guess what? Time passed by, and this young man, he bought him a house. He had 4 or 5 kids. His friend went to see him, and he wasn't home. But his wife was. It was the middle of the day. She had her house coat on. She had 1 kid on her hip, another 3 or 4 running around grabbing at her house coat. He didn't even bother to ask if she was happy or not. So anyway, when would you be happy? Are you happy? He said, "Happy? Look at this mess. Utter confusion. I could never be happy in all this. Never a good night's sleep. Never anything where it belongs. How could I be happy here?" When would you be happy? When the kids get older and they can take care of themselves, we'll be happy. Happy. How many of you have ever tried to raise teenagers? They're crazy. Sorry, teenagers. They're crazy. I was one. We're crazy. Coming and going all hours of the night, got loud music blasting everywhere. Could never be happy in all this. Well, when? well, when the kids grow up, leave home, and then there'll be peace and quiet, we'll be happy here. Well, as time rolls on, he and the wife were alone. His friend came. He said, "Are you happy now?" He said, "No, we're lonely. We're lonely. Our children are gone. They don't come home very often. We're by ourselves. We're not very happy." Now, I guess that story would be a lot funnier if it weren't so true, right? It happens to a lot of us. It happens to people in the world we know, always looking to that time down the road when we're going to be happy, right? Forgetting about counting the blessings of the situation that we're living in now. This young man here in the story, he didn't realize what he had at home. He was restless. He thought, wow, I can't wait till I get down there. I can't wait to get down the road where the action is, right? Where the fun is. That's where I want to go. So he made a request here of his father in verse 12, and he said, "And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living." Now back in those days, you got to understand that the oldest child would get 2/3, and the younger child would get 1/3 of possessions from their parents, from their inheritance, basically. I think it's over in it's over in Deuteronomy chapter 21. It actually says the oldest child would get a double portion. May seem kind of strange, or even more so used to seem kind of strange, that a man would divide up his living while he was still alive, before he died. But it was done a lot in those days, and there's some advantages to it. That way you could make sure the property was divided accordingly, the way you wanted it, and you could make assurance there that they would take care of you in your old age, and you'd already have your inheritance divided. And if things didn't work out, you could always take it back, I guess. I find it interesting here that the younger boy, he was not interested in anything from his father except what he could get out of him. He wasn't interested in his father's companionship. He wasn't interested in any advice that he might get from his father. He just wanted the portion of goods that I deserve, the portion of goods that I'm entitled to. Can I just have it? I'm going to get it anyway. It's my due, so just give it to me now. So the father gave him his release and divided up his living with him. And if you think about it, this kind of parallels our relationship with God, doesn't it? Kind of parallels our relationship. You see, if we're not content to stay with God, He's not going to make us stay with God, right? He's not going to make us stay with Him. No draftees in the Lord's army. We're all volunteers. Now, God could have made us where we had to obey. Certainly, He could have made us where we had to do what He told us to do, but He gave us all the freedom of choice. He left it up to you and I to make that choice. Another point to notice here, the boy here was actually seeking his freedom. And the irony of the whole thing is, instead of getting his freedom, he actually lost his freedom. You see, a lot of people that we know in this world feel so restricted when it comes to God and when it comes to God's expectations of them. I can't imagine anybody living like this, all Bible says you can't do this, Bible says you can't do that. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up, when I was a little boy, I thought the preacher found out what I liked to do, and he found something wrong with every single thing. We think like that when you're young. It's almost like everything we wanted to do was either illegal, immoral, or fattening, right? You ever have days like that? So the young boy here, he didn't realize what he had. So he asked for his release, and he was granted his release. And if he was going to stay in his father's house, it was going to be because he wanted to stay in his father's house. Not because somebody told him to, not because somebody forced him to, but it was going to be because he wanted to or no other reason. So we've talked a little bit about the boy at home. Now let's talk about the boy when he left home. Verse 13 says, "And not many days after the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living." So here we find the young man removed himself from his father's house. He gathered it all together, which literally means he converted everything into cash. I bet he had a garage sale. Some of us would have a field day with that. Heirlooms didn't mean anything. He got rid of all those heirlooms. He got rid of everything that had no meaning No financial meaning to him whatsoever. He probably went, who knows, he might have went and bought him a new chariot, got him a new horse, might even have got a stereo in that chariot, I don't know. But things that maybe he wasn't allowed to have while he lived at his father's house. Remember, he wanted to get down the road where the action was. And he would wave goodbye as he headed down that road to a far country. And what we need to realize from the parable here is, what does far country represent? We know what a far country represents to us, but here in the parable, what was the meaning of a far country? Last part of verse 13. And there he wasted his substance with riotous or prodigal living. And you know what? I bet he had fun. What do you think? I bet he had fun. As a matter of fact, I'm sure he had fun. You see, there's no denying that sin has pleasures. The Bible tells us that. Remember Moses over in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 and 25, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. It reads, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Sin has pleasure. It's biblical. Take Eve, for example. When she looked upon the forbidden fruit, it was a delight to her eye, right? It was a delight to her eye. It wasn't a rotten, wormy piece of fruit. It couldn't have been. I bet the old devil shined that thing every day, polished that thing up every day, just enticed her, right? And if you think about it, the world we live in today can make sin look so exciting to us, can't it? That's what it does. That's what television commercials are all about. You've seen the television commercials, how they can take things like beer and other beverage alcohol, things that Christians should avoid, but they can make them look so good and so exciting, and basically they lure the weekend with those commercials, right? Because of the excitement. Not really selling their products at all, just selling the excitement and the pleasures of sin that might be associated with those products. They make it look alluring, for sure. Out there in the world where the fun is, have fun, be free. How many times have we heard that? And how do we react when we see our kids sometimes think the same way or say the same thing? You see, for us with kids, it's just not our soul that's in danger. How about our kids and how about their souls? You got a lot going on. You got a lot of youth here in Lake City. I'm glad to see that. It's fantastic. We have a lot of youth at Lakeside. And we try to do everything we can to create programs and events to occupy their minds and to occupy them instead of letting them wander out in the world and get involved into a lot of these sin problems. But that's the righteous living that it's talking about in verse 13. The pleasures, sin, so enticing. And yes, if you think about it, there's some exciting things about sin, aren't there? It doesn't bring happiness, but it does bring excitement. It brings pleasure, but it doesn't bring everlasting joy, does it? It brings excitement, no doubt. So before we go any further, let me ask some of you, what does prodigal mean? What does the word prodigal mean? I would say a lot of us in here might not even have an idea what prodigal means. You know, we've been singing for years, God is calling the prodigal, and I'd bet that some of us have no idea who he's talking about, who he's calling. How about younger? How about erring? How about wayward, backsliding, repentant, and so on? Would that be your idea of prodigal? Well, let me tell you. I'll tell you what it means, and you'll be way ahead of those that aren't here this morning. But it means wasteful. Wasteful. He was called the prodigal son because of verse 13. Look at verse 13. And not many days after the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. He wasted. When God here in this parable is talking about the prodigal, when he's calling the prodigal son, he's calling those who are wasting their lives. He's calling those who are wasting their time and their talents, maybe even wasting their eternity. He's calling them home. And you know, this young man here in this story, he probably had a lot of friends to help him spend his money. You know, he had a lot of fun things to do. He probably had a lot of fun people to do things with. But usually in cases like this, what happens? When you go out, you have your fun, you spend all your money, what happens later? You have ruin. You know, as I was studying for this lesson and reading this chapter, I noticed that the Lord spent a lot of time here in this chapter describing the ruin and the reconciliation with the Father. Two main points, I think, to get out of the parable. Talking about the ruin and the reconciliation. Look at verses 14 and 15. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. Well, do you think he's free now? And he sent him into his fields to feed the swine. Now, how do you think that grated upon the ears of all these Jewish people? I don't think it would grade very well. You see, as a matter of fact, in a few minutes, I may go out and enjoy some pork or something like that for lunch today after worship. But I don't think that would set too well back then. You see, the Jews regarded pigs as unclean animals, and a Jew wouldn't have anything to do with that. They ate stuff like lamb and sheep and, I guess, grass carp and other fish and stuff like this. I know Dottie, a couple of years ago, went on a trip with some folks from Lakeside over to Israel. And she would text back or whatever, and she would be talking about the meal being so good and this, that, and the other. And I'm like, what are you eating? She didn't know. I guarantee you it wasn't any pork. I don't think she still knows and probably don't want to know what she ate over there. But I can guarantee you it wasn't pork. Verse 16. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate. He would have eaten anything at this time, even the pods the pigs ate. Have you ever been that hungry? I don't see why you would. I grew up in this congregation. I know the way people cook around here. There's no way you could be that hungry. But I guess some people in the world could be. And then to finish up, and no one gave him anything. No one. You see, he had lots of friends when he had lots of money. Lots of friends when lots of money. But when the money was gone, the friends were gone as well. That's one of the sad things about having money. You never know who appreciates you and loves you for who you are or for what you have. Those of us with money those of us without money might not have ever experienced that. But you know, people like Bud that's loaded, I'm sure he's experienced that in his lifetime, you know? You just never know who appreciates you for what you got or for who you are. Even though the young man was seeking his freedom, the irony is right here, he had lost his freedom. But like we said earlier, sin is like that. It's so alluring. Come on, try some. Get out here where the action is. But remember over in Proverbs 23, around verse 31, it says, look not thou upon the wine when it is red, and when it giveth its color in the cup, and moveth itself upright. Boy, how exciting it looks. How exciting they make it sound. But then there's another side of it. Another side of it. Look at the next verse following that. At the last it biteth like a serpent and stingeth like an adder. Or, as another version says, in the end, it bites like a snake and poisons like a viper. How many of our young people today have been taken in by the drug problem? How many of our adults have been taken in by the drug problem, by the alcohol problem, or other issues, have gone that route? But you know, there are other kinds of sin as well that involve enslavement, right? How about a person who is enslaved to material things? Know anybody like that? Instead of possessing his possessions possess him. Say that 6 times real fast. But we know people like that. People that feed on envy, that feed on hatred, that feed on greed. It'll get a hold of a person and it can just tear you up and make you as miserable as can be. But Jesus said you should know the truth and the truth shall set you free. Because you see, freedom, real freedom that we're talking about, is found in Jesus and that's the only way. And there he wasted his substance with riotous living and ended up having lost that which was found. Now look at verse 17. And when he came to himself, in other words, when he came to his senses, he said, how many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? This young man right here, I think, began to see for the very first time, what a fool he had been. Why, the slaves and the hired servants are better than I. He was beginning to realize. It was hitting home. It was coming back to him. At least the servants and the slaves had enough bread to eat, and here I am. I'm starving. I don't have enough food to keep my body and soul together. So he made a resolution here in verse 18. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. Notice here his admission, I have sinned. And you know, that's hard to say, right? It's hard to say. It's hard for most of us to admit that we make mistakes. It's hard for most of us to admit that we're wrong. Remember in the Garden of Eden, man was accused of eating the forbidden fruit. And what could he have said? He could have said, God, I've sinned. But did he? He didn't say it, did he? Couldn't say it. Remember what he said, Genesis 3:12? The woman thou gavest to me. He puts it on her, right? In other words, don't blame me. Don't blame me. But then turn around, and what did the woman say down in verse 13? The serpent beguiled me. She wasn't taking the blame for it either. She was putting the blame off on someone else. Remember when Moses asked Aaron about worshiping the golden calf? What did he say? The people wanted it. The people did it. Don't blame me. It's not my fault. It seems that as human beings, as soon as we tend to get in trouble, we want to start looking for someone else to put the blame on because we don't want to take the responsibility for ourselves, for our mistakes. So here, there's quite a contrast between him and the older brother. Now drop down to verse 29 here, and this is where the father goes out to the older brother, and what did he say? And he answering said to his father, Lo, these many years do I serve thee, neither transgressed I at any time thy commandment, and yet thou never gavest me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. Remember what we said at the beginning of the lesson? I think I said it anyway, forgetting things these days. But there were 4 things here in this chapter, chapter 15. 4 things that were lost. We read the chapter and we typically think of 3 things. But remember, we had the lost sheep, we had the lost coin, we had the lost boy, or the prodigal son. But how about the older son? He was lost too. And I might add that they were probably in this chapter, every one of them were found with possible exception to the older brother. The greatest sin of all for any of us is to think that we have no sin at all. That's probably our biggest mistake. And he said, the younger son, I'm going to say, make me as one of thy hired servants. You see, what we need to realize here is that a hired servant was worse off than a slave. Let me explain that to you. A slave actually lived in the house with the family. He partook of meals and this, that, and the other. A hired servant was hired to come do a specific task for a specific time, and then he was let go. So where a slave might have been bad, he was actually more of a part of the family than the hired servant was. So now for just a few minutes, let's talk about the boy back at home. Look at verse 20. And he arose and he came to his father. Now you might be sitting there wondering why the father didn't go back down that road and retrieve or haul him back. But if you think about it, that's not the way it works with God, is it? God's not coming after us. Doesn't work that way. The boy left alone, and the boy had to come home alone. He had to come back alone. Remember what we said earlier? No one is forced to serve the Lord. We're all volunteers. He's not going to make us. He could have, but he didn't. Do you realize this morning that people would gladly walk down this aisle here for you if they could. People here this morning would gladly walk down this aisle, would get in the baptismal pool for you if they could. But so much of serving God, we have to do by ourselves, right? We have to do by ourselves. Believing, we have to believe ourselves, right? Somebody can't believe for us. Facing our trials. Certainly we can get help facing our trials, but we have to face those trials. We have to face those things ourselves. How about facing death? Anybody going to take your place at that? I don't think so. We're all going to have to go there. And then finally, judgment. Wouldn't it be nice if somebody could take the judgment spot for us? But it doesn't work that way, does it? We've got to face judgment ourselves. Nobody can do it for us. We have got to come for ourselves. And you know, as I look at this chapter, I can just imagine it was a pretty lonely trip back for this young man. If you think about it, he left home dirty on the inside and clean on the outside, right? But if you think about it, how did he return home? He left home clean on the inside and dirty on the outside. A complete flip-flop of how he left home. He actually returned home in a lot better condition than when he had left. I bet at times he wondered, you know, what am I going to say when I get home? What are the servants going to think? What are the slaves going to think? And my older brother, you know how older brothers are, I told you so. You know, these thoughts had to go through his mind. But I think there was probably one thing that kept him going, that kept him on that trail. And that was, he knew that there was a father there. He knew that that father would be glad to see him. He knew that he would be met by a loving father. So then let's get down to the reconciliation. Move on down to verse 20. And he arose and he came to his father, but. Now, I don't think his father had went out that particular day to check the mail, do you? I don't think that's what he had done. I think there were probably many evenings that his father looked down that road wondering if that boy was ever going to come back home. And you know, more than likely, when he finally saw him down that road, we already said, that boy had to look a lot different than he did when he left. He had to. We know his internal self was changed completely. We know he had to look. Not nearly as well dressed, certainly not as well fed, right? But the father recognized him. He looked down that road and he recognized that boy and he said, that's my boy, that's my boy. And it says he had compassion. And that basically is the heart of this entire parable, the heart of this entire story. And he ran and he fell on his neck and he kissed him. Now take note here. Notice that it didn't say he waited till the boy got there, did it? He didn't just stand there and wait till the boy got there, or that he walked. It says he ran to the boy. That father ran to the boy. God is pictured here running. Correct me if I'm wrong, shepherds, but this is probably the only place in the entire Bible where the Scripture pictures God as running. God is pictured here as running to welcome a child back home. And you know, thinking about this boy, he had probably practiced his speech all the way back down that road toward home. He'd probably gone over that thing many times. He probably have practiced that speech more than our lads to leaders do. But what do you think? Look at verse 21. And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. Notice here, the father didn't even allow him time to finish that speech, did he? The speech that he had practiced, the father didn't allow him to finish. Look at verse 22. But the father said to his servants, bring forth the best robe and put it on him, put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. You see, he didn't even get to finish the part of the speech where it says, make me one of your hired servants. Did you notice that? His father didn't even allow him to get that far. What mattered is that the boy had come home. The boy had returned. And that's all that mattered to the father right here. Verses 23 and 24. And bring hither the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this is my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to be merry. So here we have rejoicing. It says, they began to be merry. So what's the theme here in this chapter? What is the theme if you had to capsulate a theme of this entire chapter? I'll tell you what it is. There's more joy in heaven over one sinner that repenteth than over the 99 just persons who need no repentance. You know, I can imagine as that boy was there in that road embracing his father, the one thought that probably came to him over and over again is, man, why did I wait so long? Why did I go through with this righteous living when I could have come home at any given time? Why did it take so long to come back? And you know, if I asked you mothers in the audience who have multiple children, which child do you love the most? What would you say? Think about it. This ain't no time to look at your children. Now, don't look at your children. But think about it. If I asked you with multiple children, which child do you love the most? I think I know a good answer. I love the child the most that's sick until he gets well. I love the child the most that's gone from home until he returns. Isn't that a pretty good answer? Otherwise, you'll get in trouble. Which child of God does he love the most? And we know from the parable, he loves the one that's sick until he's healed. He loves the one that's away from him until he comes back, right? That's the one. Do you realize that we probably have more than this here today, but if we had 100 people in here this morning and 99 of you needed no repentance whatsoever, but one person did, that there would be more joy in heaven, more joy from the Father over that one person that needed to repent than over the other 99. That's where the eyes of God are focused. That's where the eyes of the Father are focused. I think this one story this morning should actually show us how much interest heaven has in our salvation. Every single one of us. How badly we're missed by the Father and how welcome we would be in His arms, right? But best of all, of everything we talked about, we just want to remember that the boy had to come home himself. He had to do it by himself. And so do you, and so do I. Of all the steps that that young boy took, which one of those steps do you think was the hardest? Which one? It had to be the first step. It had to be. It gets a lot easier after that. You know, and I think about this story, and as soon as he began to recognize things on that trail, on that road back home, as soon as things began to look familiar with him, what do you think? I bet his pace picked up. What do you think? I bet finally, his feet were running as fast as his heart was beating. What do you think? The first step is always the harder. It's always the hardest, but it gets a lot easier after that. There's joy in heaven over one sinner. You know, I know you're shepherds in this congregation. I grew up in Lake City. I lived here for 40-something years, Bud. Bud and Harold Herndon were my mentors. And I know Rob, and I know Ralph, and I know Jim Flager. You've got great shepherds here. They care. They love you. And I would bet this morning, if you stepped out and took that first step this morning, I bet they would meet you in the aisle with outstretched arms. What do you think? I know them. I know so. And I would too. It might take me a while to get there, but I would be there because we have to love each other. The first step is always the hardest, but it gets easier after that. Don't let that first step be the one step that keeps you from coming to the Father. Don't let it be. While heaven waits and while the Father expects and while we sing this morning, if you have a need that we can help you with, we invite you to come forward while together we stand and while we sing.